I would like to thank you for spending the time to join me in what is our very new online HR Leaders series. The obvious topic of today is how Tennis Australia has really had to navigate and lead through the pandemic.
Yeah, that first few weeks of adrenaline, I think, is now starting to just wear off a little, and this is our new normal for the moment, and unfortunately we don't know for how much longer. So, lots of silver linings and positive moments, but then also there's some moments of, oh God, this is all a bit grim. The sporting sector almost, well, now that golf as well, but has completely been impacted from a participation perspective. So tennis in some regard, and in fact actually Australian tennis, unlike some of our global peers, were quite lucky in that we managed to squeeze in the Australian Open in January. So, and for us in terms of our operating cycle, that is 100% our sort of mothership, and really helps to fuel, in fact, everything else we do, which is around driving tennis in Australia at a community level and supporting the clubs and coaches that are out there around the country. So yeah, I suppose on one hand we were very fortunate that we had January, and we had a really successful January, so that was terrific. Equally though, and again, unfortunately it wasn't happening at the same time, but around the country various restrictions were being put in place, which meant that sort of day to day the sport was almost slowly closing down from a participant perspective. So that had flow-on implications for the various stakeholders in our delivery network. And then from an international tour perspective, that's completely suspended, with all of our professional playing cohort pretty much just training from home wherever they may be in the world. And then you start thinking toward, well, gosh, what does this look like maybe for January next year, and what sort of a world will we be living in then? So there have been lots of moments where us at Tennis have felt very grateful and fortunate, comparative to some of our other peer codes, which just purely by chance and circumstance and timing, they've just been perhaps more immediately impacted. But the longer this goes on, the more we're aware that, unlike many of our other domestic codes, we're very reliant on international travel, and as it relates to our major events. So if it gets to a point where the country might become a little bit more normal domestically, that's great for our domestic codes. But for tennis, not so much. We're still not kind of back and free running at that point. We really are hoping and needing that international flow of travel. So, greatest strength, greatest weakness. It's so interesting how every business, every industry is just impacted in its own little unique way.
Absolutely. You work in the community, deep into the community, but also with elite, sports people. How have they lent on the organisation for support?
Yeah, it's funny. I think particularly for our elite athletes, because they are sort of their own independent actor in some regard. So they sort of operate as a sole, in our language, that's sole operator. That works really well for them year round and doing their normal job. But in times like this, there's sort of this case of, oh gosh, I don't even know who to turn to for help. Like, where would we even go? Fortunately and pleasingly, in most cases they've come to us. So even if it's just an elite player saying, I don't even know whether I can play tennis at the local tennis courts, can I get tennis balls? Am I going to catch the virus from touching a ball? Do I qualify for job keeper? Do I qualify for job seeker? In their own way, they're just workers. Their profession just happens to be that of an elite athlete, but equally have been impacted like us all.
So what's been the biggest HR or people and culture challenge during this time?
When you're responsible for people who are looking for certainty, who are craving for that clarity, the ability to just be honest with them where you can, and I suppose balance that without being fearful, without driving unnecessary angst, but also just being very transparent. And look, it's evolving day to day. We've done a range of things, one of which has been to start up pulse surveys just to get a gauge of the sort of vibe of our workforce. We have roughly 700 permanent year-round staff around the country when we include our state-based member association. We'll look to do that fortnightly from now on in, but we've just crunched the data from the first one we've done, and it's so insightful. It's really useful information, very encouraging, very positive on lots of fronts, but also what they're most fearful of. That was one of our questions. It just really helps to then guide what we do as leaders and how we tone everything around the messaging that we know will be impactful, that's hopefully going to help alleviate or address some of those concerns.
Absolutely. Uncertainty is the biggest enemy. Have you had to draw on certain skills that you maybe haven't needed to draw upon as much recently?
I've really found these last few weeks this sense of, gosh, I have not worked this hard before ever. I feel an enormous sense of responsibility, and this is the time to step up. This is kind of why we're paid what we're paid, and this is about not shirting around issues, not, pushing them down the road to another day or to another person. We have to face into this and really address things. And I must say, I think I thrived on that initially. It was a real sense of adrenaline of, come on, this is really, we now need to knuckle down and find our way through it. It was powerful, and particularly even as our leadership team, it was just this sense of all the kind of normal daily BS was just out the window. It was so irrelevant, and it was such yesterday's news that it meant that we were just in the here and now, and it was about everything was evolving by the hour. And
have you found that your other executives, your team members have lent on you for different things to the normal, or is it being just a heightened sense of keeping the team together and effective? And
certainly even within the P&C team, we've reflected a lot about how this is such an enormous opportunity for us, because right now in lots of ways the business is leaning on people and culture. So much of this is just the human story, and it's about our greatest assets, the people, but equally that expense, and how do we best manage through that. So our exec have been largely the same group for nearly 6-7 years now, so with some additions along the way, which has been fantastic, but we know each other very well. So the beauty of that has been, I think we've fallen into a very natural groove of knowing each other's strengths and where and when to lean on them. The role that I have played there is being able to help be the voice of the people, and that's always something that my team and I have prided ourselves on, is staying so close to the grassroots of our workforce and being really aware and in touch with how people are feeling. And in times like this, that is invaluable.
You will have seen and heard of a number of businesses, and I hate to use the word, but they are pivoting. They are doing the pivot and are thinking about doing business differently. Some have had to. They've been absolutely, it's more push than pivot, I think. Is there another way of doing business for Tennis Australia?
Absolutely. And, like a lot of the federated sports, the national federation, so for us, TA, yes, we sit at sort of the top of that pyramid, but in fact, when you look at the sport holistically, we're just one single stakeholder in a myriad of many, and frankly, of others that are more important than us when it comes to the delivery. So in some regard, we're here to support and serve them rather than sort of lead and charge. What has been so pleasing is probably these designed project groups around what are the opportunities here, what can we leverage, but even where we're seeing at a community level groups of coaches coming together to say, oh, here's a new innovative way that we delivered hot shots to a group of primary school kids by doing some modules online, and this is the marketing campaign that we pushed it out in. And so for us to see these things coming up and saying, okay, this is awesome, how can we maybe provide a platform so that this stuff can be shared with the masses? Not to be adding the content, but just to give that ability for the messages to get out. So in some regard, that's coming from other stakeholders outside of TA. And our member associations, which are the state-based entities, I mean, they're much closer to the grassroots than TA. So again, it's about, you know, kind of knowing your role and responsibility and knowing when to lean in and not to, and just to play that role carefully to say, you know, there's clearly a heap of great work going on here. How can we best support you? This will redefine normal now, I think. We won't go back to the way things were. And I think that's fabulous.
Absolutely. And on that note, are there things that you're doing now, and even as an HR team, that are the new normal that you won't stop, you know, once all these restrictions are hopefully lifted over time?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's been some really, I mean, even on the sort of dull and boring side of our world where, you know, systems and data were just nowhere near the maturity that we needed them to be, this urgent rush and requirement for them to be cleansed and cleaned, you know, in the space of 24 hours.
Right.
Been sitting on the to-do list for 4 years. We happened to, again, coincidentally plan a multi-million-dollar investment in Workday, our new HR or ERP system, to be going live in about 3 weeks. So that's been running for over 18 months now. But in some ways, again, being in this environment right now, you've got a bit more of a captive audience. So what we're doing is sort of uptake in PD work, so L&D offerings, there may be time and patience to embrace a new system and learn it and wrap their head around it. We're kind of behind the 8th ball here, but we're about to roll out Yammer, which everyone's very excited about. And, you know, again, just to help with comms while we're working remote, but equally from all reports, that'll be a fantastic tool to carry on with. Our reward and recognition is something that we've had bubbling along for many years, but again, the focus on that at the moment really helps bring it to life. And then, as I mentioned earlier, our pulse surveys, that's something that just recently rolled out and I think would be a terrific initiative to keep live.
And of course, at Tennis Australia, you're in the business of event management on scale, aren't you? So crisis management, I would expect, would be part of that in any case, although who expected this crisis?
Yeah, no, you're right. And particularly the Australian Open is just this well-oiled machine now that's been, I mean, we go from that base of 700 year-round to over 4,000 for January. And that just happens every year. So you become very used to that cycle of activity. That said, you know, when we faced in these very early weeks, I still remember being back in the office when we were hearing these murmurings about COVID, and we were in a meeting and somebody said, oh, well, do you think we need to get ready for maybe sending all of our staff to work from home? And I was like, oh yeah, we probably should have a look at that. You know, naivety of it all back then.
No.
Yeah, and so we had created, I even just look at our crisis management sort of structure and how in those early days we just had one little group that was meeting, I think initially it wasn't even daily, to now having like a full hierarchy of project groups that have got really clear governance and sort of scope and structure that are all meeting daily, that we have you know, very much a delegation of authority charter in place. I mean, it's just so much more sophisticated now than what we had done, you know, year round with the Australian Open, but equally how we were set up at the start of this whole crisis. So, I mean, that sort of stuff is just brilliant. And what a terrific experience to be working through that sort of stuff and in time to be able to look back and say, yeah, actually, I was part of that group that worked through that crisis.
Into the future, are there considerations out of this crisis for HR people and how they develop their careers or how they develop their experience through a crisis?
You know, it's front of mind that, you know, we have to justify the role, any role in the business to show its meaning and that it is adding value under these times. So for us to have that maybe wake-up call of stripping things back to what is actually going to matter right now. What is it that the business needs from us? Because there's our long laundry list of stuff that we might like to be working on, but if it's not having an impact right now, then just stop and let's all chip in and work together on the stuff that does matter. Yeah. And I think the other thing that I've really noticed with the team is, in some regard, sort of subject matter expertise within the group, or I don't want to say that's gone out the window, but it has just been roll your sleeves up and all hands on deck. I mean, when JobKeeper was announced, the nomination form came out and it all had to be back in within sort of the space of 48 hours. I mean, we had members of the team just doing like shockingly late nights who normally would work in our recruitment talent acquisition arm, or chiming in and we're building the system and drafting up the spreadsheets ready to go and getting the forms ready. I mean, it was just a real all hands on deck. So, those transferable skills and the willingness to be very deployable, so important, because the second you get stuck in that little box, you'll find that little box might not be needed.
And how are you managing your own well-being?
Well, I did mention to you earlier, I'm 7.5 months pregnant with our second child. We've got a little 2-and-a-bit-year-old Matilda. So life is a little bit exhausting, I think is the word. But getting a bit of exercise in, trying to set up a bit of a routine where we have phone-free days just to be able to...
Great idea, yeah. Now, what's the first thing you're going to do when these lockdown restrictions are eased?
You know what, I would have said gone and, spent time with family, but I've kind of got used to it now. I mean, I don't really...
I was thinking about that. I was thinking the same thing. It's I don't think I'd change that very quickly. No. But look, thank you. It's so good to see you, and it's great to understand what different organisations are experiencing. And as I say, everyone and every organisation are very different into what they're dealing with and how they're leading through it. The consistent theme is that connection and communication, and gratitude, as you say, certainly leading the way for most. So,
thanks, Mel. So nice to see you.